Now we're going to take a look at the pancreas. And the pancreas is kind of interesting because it is both an endocrine and an exocrine gland. So the pancreas you can see here, it's going to sit actually posterior to the stomach just a little bit. And that stomach is going to wrap around and then turn into what we call the duodenum. And that's the very beginning of the small intestine. And so that the pancreas is kind of situated between the two of these. Pancreas is going to have a head, a main body portion, and then a little tail here. And we're going to get into the specifics of the pancreas more when we talk about the digestive system. But just for right now, understand that most of the pancreas is exocrine, meaning it's going to be putting out all these digestive juices from cells that we call Acini cells. And if you were to look at this pancreas here, if we kind of pull it all out, all the brown areas are going to be Acini cells, and that's going to be the same with all these cells all around here. And then you're going to have these little polka dots, which we call islets of Langerhans. And those islets of Langerhans, these sections here, are going to be our endocrine cells. But just so I can finish up with the exocrine, the pancreas is going to make all these different types of juices from these, or digestive juices from these acini, and they're going to dump them into the duodenum, which is the very first part of the small intestine. And like I said, we'll look at some of those ducts and pathways when we get to the digestive system there. 1%, just a little teeny 1% of these cells are actually going to be endocrine cells. Those endocrine cells are making up this little islet of Langerhans here. So we can see all these Acini cells surrounding these islets of Langerhans. And in these islets of Langerhans, we're going to look at 4 specific types of cells and their contributions to the endocrine system. So here's a nice picture of our pancreas here, and you can see it's being supplied by blood supply from the splenic artery and the common hepatic, a branch off of the common hepatic artery, both coming from that celiac trunk. And that third vessel, remember what that was? Left gastric artery. Anyway, we've got our pancreas, and we've said that we're looking at these islets of Langerhans cells, and there's 4 types of cells. The first one is called the alpha cells. They're these blue ones here, and they represent about 15% of all the types of cells in here. And these alpha cells are going to secrete a hormone called glucagon. And glucagon is what we call a catabolic type molecule or hormone. And by catabolic, we mean it's going to break down energy stores for usage. So it's breaking things down, taking large molecules, turning them into smaller molecules. So it's going to increase the blood glucose that's available. So it's going to increase the amount of glucose available in the blood. And how it does that is by a process called glycogenolysis. Now, you might not know what glycogen is yet, but glycogen is basically a bunch of glucose molecules, and glucose is sugars. Glucose molecules all connected together into this big network of a molecule. And so when we start breaking down glycogen, we free up and make sugar available. And the second part of this word is lysis, and lysis means to basically to break apart. So remember, whenever you have 2 kind of root words in here, they're joined by an O, they're brought together. So glycogen being torn apart. So we're taking glycogen and turning it into glucose. We're making that glucose available, and you need that for when you're getting hungry. And it's been a while since you've eaten. You've got stores of glycogen in your liver and in your muscles. So you can use these alpha cells to secrete glucagon, and that's going to break down the glycogen and make sugar available to you so that you can keep doing your activities. Now, just the opposite of that is probably what you're more familiar with. And these are going to be the beta cells. The beta cells make up 80%, all these pink orangey kind of cells in here, 80% of this islets of Langerhans. These are what we call anabolic. Anabolic means to build things up. You think of like someone taking anabolic steroids and they're bulking up their muscles. Well, with these hormones, they're anabolic in that they're going to be building up large molecules from small molecules. And they're going to be storing their energy as those large molecules. So the way that insulin works is when you have a lot of glucose in your blood, it's going to recognize that, and it's going to reduce your blood glucose. It's going to reduce it by absorbing it into different cells. I'm going to show you that on the next slide. So it's going to take glucose out of your blood, and it's going to reduce the amount of glycogenolysis that's occurring. So remember, we had glycogenolysis, breaking down of glycogen by the alpha cells, where you're going to limit that so that you don't put more glucose into your blood. And you're also going to reduce the amount of gluconeogenesis. Again, another big word. This is just gluco, meaning glucose. Neo means new, and genesis means to make. So gluconeogenesis means you're making glucose from new materials. So making glucose out of something that wasn't glucose to start with. So basically, you're just reducing the amount of glucose that's available in your system. That's what the insulin is doing. And it's going to increase glycogenesis. So glycogenesis is the opposite of glycogenolysis. You're making new glycogen. So you're taking that blood glucose that you've taken out of the system and you're turning it in to glycogen. And that can be stored in your liver or in your muscles. Because insulin is anabolic, you can also do the same with your fats and your proteins. So lipogenesis is making new fats, and protein synthesis is making new proteins out of amino acids. So insulin affects more than just glucose. It affects all of those macromolecules that make up your body systems, your sugars, your carbohydrates, your fats, and your proteins. So before I talk about delta cells, I just want to emphasize these alpha and beta cells, these guys are antagonistic to each other because they're doing opposite things. And that should be pretty clear. Now these delta cells, there's only about 5% of those. They're going to make a hormone called somatostatin. So this is our third hormone. Somatostatin is basically going to decrease all of our digestive activity. And it's going to be an anti-growth hormone. So it's basically slowing everything down. So these delta cells are basically going to be inhibiting both of these systems here. It's just slowing everything all down. And the last one is our F cells. The F cells produce pancreatic polypeptides, and basically these guys are going to inhibit the somatostatin that the D cells are producing. So the F cells are going to be inhibitory to the delta cells. So it's going to be a way of self-regulating what's going on in the pancreas. It's also going to be contracting the gallbladder. So basically, if the delta cells are slowing down your digestive activity, the F cells are going to say, oh, we might want to turn on our digestive activity again. So it's going to slow down the D cells, and it's going to cause the gallbladder here to contract. And that gallbladder is going to put out something called bile. You don't need to know this for right now, but you will when we get to the digestive system. That bile is going to emulsify fats. And by emulsifying fats, I mean it's going to break down fats so that we can, it's going to separate them out so we can break them down and digest them a little bit and absorb them into our system. So alpha and beta cells antagonistic to each other, managing primarily those sugars. Delta cells are going to slow down the whole digestive process. F cells are going to speed up the digestive process by slowing down the delta cells. So let's look at a condition now that many of you have probably heard about called diabetes mellitus. And diabetes mellitus basically means sweet urine. And the reason why they say why it was called sweet urine is because way back in the day, before they had all these fancy chemical tests, what doctors would do when they were suspecting somebody of having diabetes, and people were suspected of that when they would be peeing a whole lot, they'd be having big fluctuations in their energy levels. They would have their patients pee into a cup, and they'd take their finger, dip it in, swirl around, and yep, they'd stick it in their mouth, and they'd test it to see if it was sweet or not. And the whole reason it would be sweet is if your body had so much sugar in the blood that when it went through the kidneys and got filtered out into the filtrate, normally what happens is it all gets reabsorbed back into your system. But if you've got so much in there that you can't reabsorb it all, you're going to pee it out. So your urine would be pretty sweet. The way things normally work with the pancreas is that when you have glucose that's in your blood, that glucose is going to be signaling your glucose blood levels. Your insulin is going to detect that, and when there's a rise in glucose, it's going to put out insulin. That insulin is going to go to an insulin receptor. Because insulin cannot cross that plasma membrane, which we learned in the very first video here, then what that's going to do is it's going to open up receptors on another part of the cell so that glucose can come in and then get stored or utilized by that cell. What happens in diabetes mellitus? Well, there's actually two types of diabetes mellitus. Type 1 is when your body is not able to produce that insulin. We think it may be due to an autoimmune disease where your own body's immune cells start attacking your pancreatic cells. And as a result, you're going to not be able to produce enough, or in some cases any, insulin. And because you don't have insulin, you're not going to be able to absorb that that glucose into your cells. So that glucose remains in your blood, and you get really high blood glucose levels, and that can be very damaging, especially to small blood vessels, and the neurons get hurt, and that's why people go numb in their extremities, and they can suffer blindness in their eyes because those small blood vessels get affected first. So fortunately, there's an easy treatment for that. Well, not necessarily easy, but there is a treatment for that by giving them insulin. And then that if they restore the insulin levels and manage it with their exercise and food intake, then they can be pulling in this glucose into the cell just fine. And people with type 1 diabetes now have managed it for years, or they've got different types of pumps that can actually detect your actual insulin levels and put out the appropriate amount of insulin to match that so that you can carry on a fairly normal life. The other type of diabetes is called type 2 diabetes. In type 2 diabetes, your pancreas is actually just fine, but the problem is basically a poor diet or a sedentary type lifestyle. So your body is taking in a whole bunch of glucose, that's the poor diet part, and it's not burning it off, that's the sedentary lifestyle part. So you end up getting a lot of glucose in your blood. And the pancreas is okay, so it's going to start putting out a bunch of insulin. But the problem is when you continuously have a lot of insulin in that area, these poor little receptors are going to get overwhelmed. And remember that term that we call down regulation? Well, if we have too much insulin flooding here all the time, we get down regulation, and that's going to cause these receptors to go back into the cell and kind of hide out there. And as a result, we won't be able to accept insulin as well, so we aren't going to be pulling as much glucose into the cells, and we're going to have too much glucose into the blood, and that's going to give us similar symptoms of what we saw with type 1 diabetes. You end up with too much insulin in your, or too much blood sugar in your blood. And kind of on the fortunate side of this, often this type of diabetes can be controlled. We say it's a behavioral issue, really, by modifying your diet, by reducing the amount of carbohydrates that you have, managing them better, and also getting exercise so that you're burning off those extra carbohydrates. And that way you can manage that level a little bit better and get those receptors in a little bit of a healthier state. And that wraps up this section. I just wanted to also just kind of show you this is a real pancreas in here. You can see how it's got some ducts that are going to be going into this duodenum, and we'll be taking a look at that more closely when we talk about your digestive system.